So, as Marvel's marketing shift has revealed, Thunderbolts was new Avengers the entire time. And given the roster, yeah, this makes sense, but it doesn't seem like that was always the intention for this movie. Following its release, the director of the film, Jake Schreier, the cast and crew, all have talked about scrapped ideas that could have potentially shown up in this movie, with it seeming like the original intention was actually to make this a tried and true Thunderbolts adaptation. While Marvel doesn't have a definitive Thunderbolts roster or leader, the team we ended up getting and the story told in the movie definitely felt more New Avengers than anything Thunderbolts related. And in today's video, we are going to talk about all the scrapped ideas that were almost used in the movie, including different team members and potential plot points that have been discussed in the week since its release. Now, in the comics, the Thunderbolts were originally formed by Baron Zemo. Their creation was spawned from the Heroes Reborn storyline. This storyline happened when the Avengers and Fantastic Four comic sales were doing very poorly. So the King of Extreme, Rob Liefeld, was brought in to kind of reboot those characters in their own universe that was way more extreme, in a storyline called Heroes Reborn. However, on Earth 616, everybody just assumed the Avengers and Fantastic Four died in a battle with Onslaught. So Zemo, trying to fill the gap that those heroes left, created the Thunderbolts and enlisted supervillains, giving them new identities as superheroes. Now, since then, the Thunderbolts have been disbanded, reformed under different leaders, given new purposes, and it's kind of just become this repurposed title for different groups of characters coming together to form their own unique teams. Now, the driving force of the Thunderbolts is typically supervillains working together to do something heroic, but it has also just featured strictly anti-heroes like what we got in this movie. And I often feel like Thunderbolts gets an unfair label of being Marvel's version of Task Force X. While I do see the comparisons, I think the Thunderbolts are much more flexible in their objectives. Task Force X usually follows the formula of a prisoner having to complete a mission to get time off their jail sentence. But let's get on to the actual movie and the things that could have made it a little bit more similar to the comics Thunderbolts. The first thing I'll discuss is the team roster. So originally, Jake Schreier, a couple weeks before the release, discussed how he wanted Man-Thing on the team. This of course didn't happen because Thunderbolts wasn't a true Thunderbolts movie, it was secretly a new Avengers movie. But in addition to that, while Thunderbolts was in pre-production, Werewolf by Night was in the middle of filming, which used Man-Thing for the first time in the MCU. As much as I like that character, and I can't wait to see him on screen again, Thunderbolts was not the movie to include him in. That was from director Jake Schreier though. The rest of what I'm going to talk about actually came from an interview with co-writer of the movie, Eric Pearson. Pearson has quietly been working on a ton of MCU stuff in the background for a couple of years now. He originally wrote a lot of the Marvel one-shots from Phase 1 and 2, co-wrote the screenplay for Thor Ragnarok, and did uncredited rewrites on a ton of MCU movies. Black Widow was his first solo screenplay credit, and it seems like he is going to be playing a larger role in the MCU going forward as he's co-written Thunderbolts and Fantastic Four First Steps. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here comes from an interview that he did with The Wrap talking about the scrapped versions of the movie. In his original pitch, the movie would have featured adamantium very heavily, and this was completely unrelated to its usage in Captain America Brave New World. He didn't go into the actual usage that adamantium would have played in the final movie, but I'm assuming that it would have played a role similar to what we got with Project Sentry. One of the other more interesting ideas that he discussed was a much smaller scale version of the movie that would have taken place entirely in the vault. Now, the vault does play a very major role in the first two acts of the final movie, but the original idea for it would have been to just do a superhero version of Die Hard. Have all of these characters trapped underground with each other, they're sent there to kill one another, and when that doesn't happen, the mercenaries come in to finish the job. I do think that would have been a really cool idea, especially if they didn't get the budget that Thunderbolts ended up having, and I'd like them to revisit ideas like that for future projects. The next possibility was a version of the movie where John Walker was the main antagonist. Now, it's pretty clear why this version of the movie didn't happen. It would have featured John Walker instead of Thunderbolt Ross becoming the Red Hulk. Valentina would manipulate John Walker into thinking that the super soldier serum was deteriorating. So while he would be on the team initially, there would be a mid-act twist where he turns on the team and a Hulk bomb is essentially inserted for the grand finale. They say they didn't use this because it didn't feel right, but I'm pretty sure the main reason they didn't go with this storyline is because of the development of Captain America: Brave New World. But the idea of using Sentry in the movie came from that idea. I do really like the final version of John Walker that we ended up getting in the movie though. It felt like a natural progression of the character that we saw in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and he works better as an arrogant and egotistical version of Captain America rather than a straight up villain. But then there is probably the most desired version of the movie that they talked about here, where Taskmaster ended up living. Now I know this version of Taskmaster gets a lot of heat, but I felt like Thunderbolts was a good way to try and redeem that character. If you haven't seen the movie, what are you doing here? But Taskmaster is pretty unceremoniously killed off very early on. But in an original version of the movie, Taskmaster and Ghost both had a subplot where they kind of related to each other. And I think the movie is kind of missing out on this element. While I do like everything Ghost does in the movie, I feel like Ava didn't really have too much character development going on. She is by far one of the weaker characters in the final movie. And another possible addition of Bill Foster, her adoptive father, being in the movie and turning into the superhero known as Goliath, could have built up her character a lot more instead of just being the reluctant hero. Bill Foster was apparently only in the original version of the movie where Walker turned into Red Hulk though. We also would have gotten a lot more of each of the characters' different trauma rooms in the Void. Now, I don't think this was totally necessary to include. A lot of the characters we know very intimately, and we've seen the trauma that they've gone through firsthand. However, characters like John Walker and Yelena, who both had their own interesting traumas that we never really explored, were definite inclusions that I'm glad we got in the final movie. But we've dealt pretty heavily with Bucky's trauma previously. We've already seen Red Guardian at his lowest, so we didn't really need to revisit that. And we got a look at the darkest corners of Ava's trauma in Ant-Man and the Wasp. But Yelena's trauma room was originally going to be expanded to include a cameo from Scarlett Johansson. Now, I understand why the discussion of including her would have been on the table. She's an executive producer of the movie, and the connection between Natasha Romanoff and Yelena Belova is pretty significant to both of these characters. But, and I think this is a lesson Marvel really needs to learn, that bringing her back would have really devalued her sacrifice in Avengers Endgame and the conclusion of Black Widow. I think her presence is felt well enough in the final version of the film. But that brings us to our final big change that he discussed in this interview. There was a version of the movie where the Thunderbolts just never became the new Avengers. They stayed as the Thunderbolts. In the interview, he said, Valentina announces the formation of the Thunderbolts to an anxious crowd of press and onlookers, and Yelena leans in and tells Valentina, "You work for us now." But when he presented the idea to Feige, Pearson received what he called the best response I've ever gotten. Feige turned to Pearson and said she should have introduced them as the Avengers. And I was thinking, if that's the only note I'm getting out of this, take the money and run. And yeah, that was a great way to conclude the movie and a great final note to end it on. But I also think it leaves the door open for a later team of Thunderbolts to come along and claim that title. Those are all the major exclusions from the final film that have been discussed in the past couple of weeks though. Which one was your favorite? Which do you wish was included in the final movie? Let me know in the comments down below. That's gonna do it for this video though. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.